The great crystal towers of Centauri Prime had seen the same meeting for 3,000 years. Every cycle, representatives from 47 different alien species would gather in the massive chambers to discuss the galaxy's business. They talked about trade routes between star systems, settled arguments over territory, and made sure the balance of power stayed stable across the stars. The Vorthek Empire, with their tall reptilian bodies and sharp teeth, controlled the eastern part of the galaxy. The crystalline collective, beings made of living rock and metal, ran most of the mining operations on distant worlds. The ethereal syndicate, creatures of pure energy that floated like glowing clouds, managed all communication between the stars. Everyone had their place, everyone knew the rules, and everyone followed the same old patterns that had worked for thousands of years. Nobody had bothered to check on the small blue planet orbiting a yellow star in the outer rim for quite some time. It was listed in their records as Sol 3 and marked as having primitive life forms that had barely discovered fire. The last survey was over 200 years ago. Captain Jake Morrison was about to change all of that. The USS Liberty dropped out of hyperspace above Centauri Prime like a thunderbolt. The massive ship, painted in deep blue with white stars scattered across its hull, appeared directly over the council chambers without any warning. The vessel was 3 times larger than most ships in the area, and it bristled with weapons that looked nothing like the elegant energy beams favored by galactic civilizations. These were crude, powerful, and obviously designed to cause maximum damage along the side of the ship. Painted in letters tall enough to be seen from the planet's surface were the words, "Don't tread on me," written in 12 different languages. Most of the aliens had never seen those words before, but somehow they understood the message perfectly. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, looking down at the glittering city below. He was a tall man with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes from years of staring into space. His uniform was different from anything the galaxy had ever seen, practical, sturdy, and decorated with patches that showed eagles, flags, and symbols that meant nothing to alien eyes but everything to the humans who wore them. "Well, would you?" "Look at that," Morrison said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone from Texas. "Looks like they started the party without us." Dr. Lisa Rodriguez stood beside him, her tablet already recording everything they could see. She was a small woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes were bright with curiosity. As the mission's chief scientist, she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. "Captain, we're getting hundreds of different signals," she reported. "One count 437 different frequencies trying to talk to us all at once. I think we got their attention." Down in the crystal chambers, emergency alarms were ringing for the first time in centuries. The Galactic Council had procedures for everything: trade disputes, territorial conflicts, even natural disasters. But nobody had ever written a procedure for what to do when an unknown ship appeared out of nowhere and parked itself over their most important city. Ambassador Zethkalar of the Vorthek Empire was the first to speak. He was 7 feet tall, covered in dark green scales, and wore the ceremonial robes that marked him as one of the galaxy's most important diplomats. His species had been part of the council since its beginning, and he had never seen anything like this. "Unknown vessel," his voice boomed through the universal translator system. "You have broken 17 different interstellar laws by entering this system without proper papers, clearance, or invitation. Tell us who you are right now." Morrison leaned back in his captain's chair and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had been in a lot of fights and wasn't worried about getting into one more. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the United States Space Force," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I represent the United States of America Earth Sol System. We're here because nobody sent us an invitation to your little meeting, and where I come from, that's just plain rude." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of the ship's engines seemed loud in comparison. The universal translator worked perfectly, so every being in the chamber understood the words. But understanding the words and understanding their meaning were two very different things. "United States of America," Zethkalar repeated, his forked tongue flicking out nervously. We have no record of such a nation in our files. That's because you never asked, Morrison replied. We've been sitting in the Sol system for the past 50 years, building ships and wondering why nobody ever came to say hello. Finally figured we'd come introduce ourselves. The council erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began talking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of sounds that the translator couldn't handle. Some were angry, some were scared, and some were just confused. The humans had appeared out of nowhere, with technology that shouldn't exist, claiming to represent a world that wasn't supposed to have intelligent life. Dr. Rodriguez was taking notes on everything, her fingers flying across her tablet. Captain, she said quietly, their reaction is fascinating. They're exhibiting classic signs of cognitive dissonance. Their entire worldview just got turned upside down. Good, Morrison said. About time someone shook things up around here. The Ethereal Syndicate's representative, a being of pure energy named Luminous Thought Ascending, flickered with colors that indicated deep confusion. How is this possible? The creature asked. Our records show that your species discovered fire only moments ago in galactic terms. Well, Morrison said, we're fast learners. Took us about 10,000 years to go from hitting things with sticks to building these ships. We're pretty proud of that. Commander Amy Patterson, the Liberty's communications officer, was a young woman from California with short blonde hair and the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was very good at her job. She had been monitoring all the different signals coming from the planet and the ships around it. Captain, she reported, I'm picking up military frequencies. Looks like they're scrambling their defense forces. Morrison's smile got wider. They now? Well, that's interesting. Lisa, what do you make of their ships? Dr. Rodriguez pulled up tactical displays on her tablet. They're more advanced than ours in some ways, but they seem to be built for completely different purposes. Their weapons are designed for precision strikes, not maximum damage. Their ships are elegant but fragile. I don't think they're used to serious fighting. That's what I figured, Morrison said. He activated his communications system and spoke to the entire galaxy for the first time. This is Captain Morrison to all ships in the area. We didn't come here to fight, but we're Americans and we're ready for whatever you want to throw at us. Now, somebody want to explain to me why Earth wasn't invited to this council of yours? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Council had operated under the assumption that any species advanced enough to join them would naturally seek guidance from the established powers. They had procedures for contact, integration, and gradual acceptance into galactic society, but the humans hadn't followed any of those procedures. They had simply shown up, uninvited and heavily armed, demanding to know why they had been left out. It was unprecedented, it was rude, and it was absolutely terrifying, because deep down, every member of the council knew that the humans had a point. They had been ignored, dismissed, and excluded from the galaxy's most important decisions. And now they were here, clearly not in a mood to be ignored anymore. Morrison waited for an answer, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Behind him, the bridge crew of the Liberty went about their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who had trained for this moment their entire lives. They were representatives of a species that had never learned to give up, never learned to back down, and never learned to ask permission when they could simply take action. The galaxy was about to learn what that meant. The news that humans had built faster-than-light ships without any help from the galaxy's established powers sent shockwaves through every corner of known space. For 3,000 years, the same pattern had repeated over and over. A species would develop basic technology, the Galactic Council would make contact, and then the newcomers would be slowly guided into galactic society under the watchful eyes of their more advanced neighbors. The humans had thrown that entire system out the window. Lieutenant Commander Amy Patterson found herself in the strange position of explaining human history to a room full of aliens who had never met a species quite like theirs. She stood in the council's main briefing chamber, surrounded by creatures that looked like living crystals, floating energy clouds and reptilian beings with too many eyes. They all stared at her with the kind of fascination usually reserved for dangerous animals in a zoo. You have to understand, Patterson said, speaking slowly and clearly. We've been fighting wars for our entire recorded history. We've had 2 world wars, a Cold War, and about 100 smaller conflicts just in the last century. We're really good at it. The ethereal syndicate's representative, luminous thought ascending, flickered with colors that the translator said meant confusion. But surely your species seeks peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit through trade and cooperation. Patterson smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, we do that too. But we also believe in peace through superior firepower. It's worked pretty well for us so far. The alien delegates exchanged glances that would have been worried if they had been human. They were starting to understand that these newcomers were fundamentally different from anything they had encountered before. Chief Engineer Danny Walsh had been given permission to examine some of the Council's technology, much to the horror of the assembled scientists. Walsh was a stocky man from Detroit with grease under his fingernails and the kind of practical intelligence that came from fixing things that were never supposed to break. Within 6 hours, he had reverse engineered their quantum communicators, improved their efficiency by 30%, and was already sketching plans for turning them into weapons. Back home, we call this Tuesday, he explained to a group of horrified crystalline collective scientists who had spent centuries perfecting the same technology. Dr. Kethmer, the Council's chief scientist, watched Walsh work with growing alarm. How is this possible? He asked. These systems took our greatest minds 500 years to develop. Walsh looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. Well, we've had a lot of practice taking things apart and putting them back together. Plus, we don't have 500 years to waste on something that should work right the first time. The real shock came when the humans began demonstrating their approach to problem solving. The Vorthek Empire and the Nexus Coalition had been locked in a territorial dispute for over 2 centuries. Both sides had filed thousands of diplomatic protests, counter-protests, and appeals. The case files filled an entire archive wing, and teams of lawyers from both sides had spent their entire careers arguing over the same 3 star systems. Colonel Rick Barnes, the Liberty's military advisor, listened to both sides present their cases for exactly 15 minutes. He was a tall, lean man from Colorado with the kind of patience that came from dealing with bureaucrats for most of his military career. When the lawyers finished talking, he stood up and walked to the star map that dominated the center of the chamber. All right, here's what we're gonna do, Barnes said, pointing at the contested systems. You, he pointed at the Vorthek representative, get the 3 systems on the left. You, he pointed at the Nexus delegate, get the 3 systems on the right. The 2 systems in the middle become neutral territory, and if either of you has a problem with that, you can take it up with us. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of the chamber's air recycling system seemed loud in comparison. Both sides stared at Barnes as if he had just suggested they set their own ships on fire. But the legal precedents, stammered the Vorthek layer, the mining rights, the historical claims. We have documentation going back 800 years. Barnes shrugged. And how's that working out for you? You've been arguing for 2 centuries and gotten nowhere. My way, everybody gets something, nobody gets everything, and you can all go back to doing something useful with your time. The Nexus representative, a being that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a computer, pulsed with agitated colors. This is highly irregular. The Council has procedures for these matters. Yeah, and your procedures don't work, Barnes replied. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been fighting about this for 200 years. Captain Morrison had been invited to address the full Galactic Council, and his speech would be studied by alien historians for decades to come. He stood at the center of the great chamber, looking up at the thousands of delegates arranged in concentric circles around him. He had given speeches before, but never to an audience quite like this one. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished energy beings, he began, his Texas drawl carrying clearly through the vast space. I'm not gonna stand here and pretend we're perfect. We've made mistakes, we've fought wars, and we've got problems back home just like everyone else. But here's the thing about Americans. We don't give up. We don't back down, and we sure as hell don't let bullies push us around. The Universal Translator struggled with some of the more colorful expressions, but the message was clear enough. The delegates listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for natural disasters or declarations of war. Now, from what I've seen, you folks have been playing the same game for 3,000 years. Same rules, same players, same problems. Well, we're here now, and we're going to shake things up a bit. We're offering something you've never had before, a species that's too stubborn to quit and too crazy to know when we're outgunned. Dr. Rodriguez was giving her own presentation to the Council's Science Division, and her words were perhaps the most frightening of all. She stood in front of a room full of the galaxy's greatest minds, explaining human nature with the calm precision of someone describing the weather. You have to understand, she said, humans are persistence hunters. We don't give up, ever. We will literally chase our prey until it dies of exhaustion. We've applied this same principle to everything from sports to space exploration. When we decide we want something, we keep going until we get it. The assembled scientists exchanged glances that would have been nervous if they had been human. They were beginning to understand that these newcomers operated on completely different principles than the rest of the galaxy. Take our space program, Rodriguez continued. We went from our first powered flight to landing on our moon in 66 years. We built our first space station while we were still using chemical rockets. We didn't wait for better technology, we used what we had and made it work. Dr. Veltar, a respected physicist from the hegemony, raised a tentacle. But surely you must have had guidance from more advanced civilizations? Rodriguez shook her head. Nope, we figured it out ourselves. We made mistakes, we learned from them, and we kept going. That's what humans do. The implications were not lost on the assembled scientists. Here was a species that had developed advanced technology through pure determination and stubbornness. They hadn't waited for help, hadn't followed established patterns, and hadn't asked permission. They had simply decided what they wanted and gone after it with single-minded determination. Commander Patterson was fielding questions from the Council's military advisors, and their confusion was obvious. Your tactics make no sense, complained General Thekmore of the Dominion forces. You appear to have no unified command structure, no standardized equipment, and no coherent strategy. That's because we don't fight like you do, Patterson explained. We adapt, we improvise, we use whatever works and throw out whatever doesn't. Every human unit can operate independently if they need to. But that's chaos, protested another military leader. How do you coordinate your forces? Patterson grinned. We don't. We give everyone the same objective and let them figure out how to achieve it. Works pretty well for us. The galaxy was slowly beginning to understand that humanity represented something entirely new. They were a species that had developed advanced technology through brute force determination, solved problems through direct action rather than endless debate, and approached warfare with a flexibility that made them unpredictable and dangerous. More importantly, they seemed to genuinely not care about the established rules and hierarchies that had governed galactic civilization for thousands of years. They were polite enough, but they made it clear that they would do things their own way, regardless of what anyone else thought. The question that hung in the air was simple. What did the galaxy do with a species that refused to follow the rules? The answer, as everyone was beginning to realize, was that the galaxy didn't have a choice. The humans were here, they were staying, and they were going to change everything whether the established powers liked it or not. The old order was ending, and nobody knew what would replace it. Word spread through the galaxy faster than light itself. The humans had arrived, and they were nothing like anything the established powers had ever seen before. Within days of the Liberty's dramatic appearance over Centauri Prime, ships were arriving from every corner of known space. Species that had been locked in diplomatic stalemates for centuries suddenly wanted to meet these newcomers who seemed to cut through red tape like it was made of paper. Commander Beth Wilson found herself busier than she had ever been in her life. As the Liberty's chief negotiator, she had expected to spend her time learning alien customs and figuring out how to communicate with beings who thought in ways completely different from humans. Instead, she was mediating disputes that the galaxy's best diplomats had given up on decades ago. Wilson was a practical woman from Ohio who had spent 15 years in the State Department before joining the Space Force. She had negotiated trade deals with hostile nations, resolved border disputes between countries that had been fighting for generations, and once talked a terrorist out of blowing up a bridge using nothing but common sense and a translator app. She thought she was ready for anything. She was wrong. The first delegation to request human mediation came from the hegemony trade wars, a conflict that had been dragging on for over a century. 6 different species had been fighting over shipping routes through the Kepler sector, filing lawsuits, imposing sanctions, and generally making life miserable for everyone involved. The legal documents alone filled 3 storage buildings. Wilson listened to all 6 sides present their cases, a process that took nearly 8 hours. The representatives spoke in complex legal language, quoted precedents from cases that were older than human civilization, and argued about details so small that Wilson needed a magnifying glass to see them on the star charts. When they finished, Wilson stood up and walked to the holographic display showing the disputed sector. "All right," she said, "let me make sure I understand this. You're all fighting over who gets to use these shipping lanes, right?" "It's far more complex than that," protested Ambassador Hethcall of the Merchant Federation. "There are questions of historical precedent, traditional usage rights, and economic impact assessments that must be considered. But basically, you all want to use the same roads to move your stuff," Wilson continued, ignoring the protests. "And instead of sharing, you've been fighting about it for 100 years. The delegates exchanged glances. When she put it like that, it did sound rather silly. "Here's what we're gonna do," Wilson said, pointing at the display. "Monday through Wednesday, the Federation gets priority access. Thursday through Saturday, the collective gets their turn. Sunday is neutral day. Anyone can use it, but no priority for anybody. You rotate the schedule every year so everyone gets a fair shot at the good days." The silence that followed was broken by nervous coughing from several delegates. Finally, Trade Minister Velthan of the Crystal Collective spoke up. "But the legal frameworks. The precedent studies, the economic impact reports, what about them?" Wilson asked. "Are you making money fighting in court, or are you making money shipping goods?" It was a question that none of them had ever considered. They had been so focused on winning the legal battle that they had forgotten about the practical purpose behind it. Captain Morrison, meanwhile, was discovering that his reputation had preceded him throughout the galaxy. Every day brought new visitors to the Liberty, representatives from species that had problems they couldn't solve using traditional methods. Some were curious, some were desperate, and some were just tired of the endless bureaucracy that seemed to govern everything in galactic society. The most interesting visitor was Ambassador Kethelin of the Frontier Coalition, a group of smaller species that had been trying to gain representation in the Galactic Council for over 2 centuries. They had filed the proper paperwork, followed all the procedures, and waited patiently for their application to be processed. They were still waiting. "The thing is," Kethelin explained to Morrison over coffee in the Liberty's mess hall, "we've done everything by the book. We've met all the requirements, passed all the tests, and proven that we're responsible members of galactic society. But the Council keeps finding new requirements, new tests, new hoops for us to jump through." Morrison sipped his coffee and nodded. "Sounds like they don't want you in the club." That's what we're starting to think," Kethelin admitted. "But we don't know what else to do. The legal system is designed to favor the established powers, and we don't have the resources to fight them directly." "Who says you have to fight them?" Morrison asked. "Sometimes the best way to deal with a locked door is to find a window." The next day, Morrison requested a meeting with the full Galactic Council. When he was granted 15 minutes to address the assembly, he used the time to make an announcement that would change everything. "The United States of America hereby recognizes the Frontier Coalition as a sovereign governmental entity," he declared. We will be establishing full diplomatic relations, including trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cultural exchange programs. Any species that wishes to join this new alliance is welcome to apply." The reaction was immediate and explosive. The established powers began protesting before Morrison had even finished speaking. They cited laws, precedents, and procedures that supposedly prevented such recognition. They demanded that the humans follow proper channels and respect established authority. Morrison listened to about 5 minutes of complaints before holding up his hand for silence. "Here's the thing," he said. "We're not part of your council, so we don't have to follow your rules. We'll recognize whoever we want to recognize, and we'll make deals with whoever we want to make deals with. If you don't like it, that's your problem." The implications were staggering. In a single stroke, the humans had created an alternative to the Galactic Council's authority. Species that had been locked out of the established system suddenly had another option, another path to legitimacy and recognition. Dr. Rodriguez was conducting her own experiments in human-style diplomacy, though her methods were more subtle than Morrison's direct approach. She had been invited to observe a scientific conference where researchers from 12 different species were trying to collaborate on a joint project to study dark matter. The project had been in planning for 15 years. The researchers had held hundreds of meetings, written thousands of reports, and created organizational charts so complex that they required their own instruction manual. They had committees to oversee other committees, subcommittees to review the work of the main committees, and oversight boards to make sure the subcommittees were doing their jobs properly. They had not yet begun any actual research. Rodriguez watched the proceedings for 3 days before finally standing up during a heated debate about the proper protocol for submitting equipment requisitions. "Excuse me," she said, "but has anyone actually tried to study dark matter yet?" The room fell silent. Professor Hechtoil of the Advanced Research Institute looked confused. "We are in the preliminary organizational phase. Actual research cannot begin until all administrative frameworks are in place." "How long will that take?" Rodriguez asked. "Our current projections suggest another 8 to 10 years, replied Dr. Valmiron of the Theoretical Physics Collective. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "And how long would it take to actually do the research once you start?" "Perhaps 2 years, Hector admitted. "So you're going to spend 25 years planning something that will take 2 years to complete?" Rodriguez asked. When she put it like that, it sounded absurd even to the aliens. "Why don't you just start?" Rodriguez suggested. "Pick a team. Give them some equipment and see what they can find. If it works, great. If it doesn't, try something else." The concept of simply beginning work without extensive planning was apparently revolutionary. Chief Engineer Walsh was having similar experiences with the galaxy's technical specialists. He had been invited to review the specifications for a new type of faster-than-light communicator that the Council's engineers had been developing. The project was scheduled to take 50 years and cost enough money to buy a small star system. Walsh spent 2 days reviewing their plans before calling a meeting with the project leaders. "This is too complicated," he announced. "You're trying to solve 12 different problems at once. Pick one problem, solve it, then move on to the next one." "But the integrated approach ensures optimal efficiency," protested Chief Engineer Mector. "No, it ensures that if one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong," Walsh replied. "Build it simple, test it, fix what breaks, then make it better." The aliens were beginning to understand that humans approached problems from a completely different angle than the rest of the galaxy. Where others saw the need for careful planning and extensive preparation, humans saw opportunities to take action and learn from the results. More importantly, the humans seemed to genuinely not care about the established hierarchies and procedures that governed galactic society. They were polite enough, but they made it clear that they would do things their own way regardless of what anyone else thought. The question that everyone was asking was simple: what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object? The honeymoon period ended on a Tuesday morning when the emergency alert came through the Liberty's communication system. Commander Patterson was enjoying her first cup of coffee when the priority message appeared on her screen, marked with the Red codes that meant someone was in serious trouble, the USS Ranger. A small survey ship with a crew of 42 Americans had been conducting routine exploration in the outer rim systems. They were mapping new trade routes and looking for planets that might be suitable for colonies. It was boring, peaceful. Work that nobody expected to be dangerous. The Dominion of Kethmar had other ideas. The Dominion was a militaristic empire that had been expanding steadily for 5 centuries. They controlled over 300 star systems and had a reputation for taking what they wanted without asking permission. Their ships were built for war, their soldiers were trained from childhood to fight, and their leaders believed that might made right. They had been watching the humans with growing irritation. These newcomers were disrupting the established order, making alliances with species that should have remained weak, and generally causing problems for the galaxy's traditional power structure. The Dominion leadership decided it was time to teach the humans their place. The attack came without warning. 3 Dominion warships dropped out of hyperspace around the Ranger and opened fire immediately. The survey ship never had a chance to surrender, never had a chance to explain their presence, never had a chance to do anything except send out a single distress signal before the Dominion's weapons tore them apart. Captain Morrison received the news while he was in the middle of a trade negotiation with the Merchant Guild. He was sitting across from Ambassador Velkoth, discussing shipping contracts and tariff rates, when Patterson burst into the conference room with her face pale and her hands shaking. "Sir," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "we just received a distress signal from the Ranger." "They're gone, sir, all hands lost." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and the alien delegates unconsciously moved away from him. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, but there was something underneath it that made everyone in the room nervous. "Who?" he asked. "The Dominion of Kethmar?" Patterson replied. "They claimed the system was in their territory and that the Ranger was trespassing. They didn't give any warning, didn't try to communicate. They just opened fire." Morrison stood up slowly, his hands flat on the conference table. "Commander Patterson," he said quietly, "please send a message to Earth. Tell them we need the fleet." The Merchant Guild representatives looked confused. Ambassador Velkoth tilted his head in the way his species did when they were trying to understand something. "Captain Morrison, surely this matter can be resolved through diplomatic channels. The Galactic Council has procedures for handling territorial disputes." Morrison turned to look at him, and Velkoth took an involuntary step backward. "Ambassador," Morrison said, his Texas drawl more pronounced than usual, "the Dominion just declared war on the United States of America. They killed 42 of my people without provocation, without warning, and without mercy. They're about to learn why that's a very bad idea. What happened next would be remembered in galactic history as the moment everything changed." The hyperspace jump points around Centauri Prime began lighting up like Christmas trees as ship after ship emerged from faster-than-light travel. But these weren't the elegant, streamlined vessels that the galaxy was used to seeing. These were warships, built for one purpose and one purpose only. The human fleet arrived in a massive wave that blotted out the stars. Hundreds of vessels, ranging from sleek destroyers that move like angry wasps to massive battle cruisers that look like flying cities, all painted in the same defiant blue and bearing names that meant nothing to alien ears but everything to the humans who served on them. USS Constitution, USS Gettysburg, USS Normandy, USS Yorktown, USS Midway. Each name carried the weight of human history, the memory of battles fought and won by people who refused to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. At the center of the fleet was the flagship USS Enterprise, a massive vessel that dwarfed even the largest council ships. From its bridge, Admiral Patricia Hayes broadcast on all frequencies, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years protecting American interests around the globe, and was now ready to do the same among the stars. "This is Admiral Hayes of the United States Space Force," she announced. "The Dominion of Kethmar has committed an act of war against the United States of America by attacking and destroying one of our vessels without provocation. We are here to provide a proportional response. The Galactic Council's emergency session was called within minutes. The great crystal chambers that had seen 3,000 years of peaceful debate suddenly found themselves hosting representatives who were terrified of what was about to happen. They had protocols for handling conflicts between member species, procedures for mediation and arbitration, and established methods for preventing wars before they started. None of those procedures covered what to do when a species showed up with enough firepower to level planets and a demonstrated willingness to use it. The Council's mediator, a peaceful being named Harmony Seeks Balance, attempted to intervene. Harmony belonged to a species that had evolved beyond physical conflict centuries ago, and the concept of military retaliation was almost impossible for them to understand. "Admiral Hayes," Harmony said, their voice carrying the musical tones, "that their species used to express deep concern. Surely this matter can be resolved through diplomatic channels. The Dominion's actions, while regrettable, do not warrant such a massive military response. The loss of life you are contemplating will be far greater than the original tragedy." Hayes's response would be quoted in military academies for generations to come. She stood at the center of the council chamber, surrounded by representatives from dozens of species, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had made hard decisions before and was prepared to make them again. "Harmony seeks balance," she said. "I understand that your species has moved beyond physical conflict, and I respect that. But you need to understand something about humans. When someone kills our people, we don't file a complaint with the authorities. We don't negotiate with lawyers. We don't wait for committees to decide what the appropriate response should be. We respond immediately, decisively, and with enough force to make sure it never happens again." The alien delegates listened with growing horror as Hayes continued. "The Dominion made a choice when they opened fire on the Ranger. They chose to start a war with the United States of America. Now they get to live with the consequences of that choice." The Dominion's representative, General Vekver, was a 7-foot-tall warrior with battle scars covering his armored hide. He had fought in dozens of conflicts, conquered entire star systems, and never backed down from a fight in his life. But something about the human admiral made him nervous. "You are vastly outnumbered," he pointed out. "The Dominion fleet consists of over 2,000 vessels. Your forces, while impressive, cannot possibly match our military strength." Hayes smiled, and it was not a reassuring expression. "General, you're thinking like someone who fights wars the old way. Set pieces, line battles, ships shooting at each other until one side gives up. That's not how Americans fight." She activated a holographic display that showed the Dominion's territory. "You have 2,000 ships, but they're spread across 300 star systems. You have supply lines that stretch across half the galaxy. You have civilian populations that depend on those supply lines for everything from food to medical supplies." The display zoomed in to show critical infrastructure points throughout Dominion space. "We don't need to destroy your entire fleet, General. We just need to cut your supply lines, take out your communication networks, and make it impossible for you to coordinate your forces. After that, your ships become very expensive pieces of scrap metal floating in space." The implications were staggering. The humans weren't planning to fight a traditional war at all. They were planning to dismantle the Dominion's entire civilization from the inside out. Captain Steve Murphy, commanding the destroyer USS Alamo, received his orders while his ship was still emerging from hyperspace. Murphy was a career Navy officer from San Diego who had spent most of his career hunting submarines in Earth's oceans. The tactics were different in space, but the principles were the same. Find the enemy, hit them where they weren't expecting it, and disappear before they could hit back. "All right, people," Murphy announced to his crew over the ship's intercom. "We're going hunting. The Dominion thinks they can kill Americans and get away with it. We're going to show them how wrong they are." The USS Alamo and 5 other destroyers slipped away from the main fleet and disappeared into hyperspace. Their destination was the Kethmore home system, the heart of the Dominion's power and the last place anyone would expect a human attack back. In the council chambers, the debate raged on. Some species called for immediate intervention to prevent the war from spreading. Others argued that the Dominion had brought this on themselves and deserved whatever happened to them. The war with the Dominion of Kethmor lasted exactly 72 hours. In the entire history of galactic warfare, no conflict had ever ended so quickly or so decisively. The galaxy's military experts would spend decades trying to understand how a force of a few hundred human ships had completely dismantled an empire that controlled 300 star systems. Captain Steve Murphy, commanding the destroyer USS Alamo, later described the final battle in terms that would become legendary. Among military historians, "They fought like they were following a manual," he said. "We fought like we were writing one." Murphy's small task force had penetrated the supposedly impregnable Kethmor home system using tactics that no Dominion commander had ever seen before. Instead of attacking the heavily defended military installations, the humans went after the infrastructure that kept the system running. They disabled power plants, communication satellites, and supply depots. They knocked out the traffic control systems that managed ship movements around the planet within 6 hours. The heart of the Dominion's empire was effectively paralyzed. Ships couldn't communicate with each other, couldn't coordinate their movements, and couldn't even figure out where the human attackers were hiding. The Dominion's massive fleet found itself fighting shadows that appeared from nowhere, struck critical targets, and vanished before anyone could respond. Admiral Hayes coordinated the assault from the USS Enterprise, but her role was less like a traditional fleet commander and more like a conductor leading an orchestra. Each human ship operated independently, following general objectives rather than specific orders. When opportunities presented themselves, captains took them. When plans needed to change, they changed them without waiting for permission. The Dominion's rigid command structure couldn't adapt fast enough. Their admirals were used to controlling every aspect of a battle, giving detailed orders to ships that followed them without question. When the human attacks disrupted their communication networks, the Dominion fleet simply fell apart. Individual ships found themselves isolated, confused, and unable to coordinate with their allies. Commander Beth Wilson, now serving as the fleet's diplomatic officer, was present when the Dominion's leadership finally requested a ceasefire. The meeting took place aboard a neutral vessel provided by the Galactic Council, with representatives from both sides sitting across from each other in what had once been a luxury passenger lounge. General Thekver, the same Dominion leader who had dismissed human military capabilities just 3 days earlier, looked like he had aged 10 years. His ceremonial armor was dented and scorched, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had watched his entire world collapse around him. "We surrender," he said simply. "The Dominion formally requests terms for ending hostilities." Wilson opened a folder containing the documents that Admiral Hayes had prepared. The terms were straightforward and non-negotiable. The Dominion would pay reparations to the families of the Ranger's crew. They would submit to human oversight of their military to ensure they never again attack civilian vessels without cause. They would provide full compensation for the costs of the war they had started. Most importantly, they would publicly acknowledge that they had been wrong to attack the USS Ranger, and that their unprovoked aggression had been a violation of basic galactic law. "These terms are harsh," Thekver protested weakly. "They're fair," Wilson replied. "You started a war by killing innocent people. You lost that war because you underestimated your opponents. Now you pay the price. The alternative is we continue fighting until there's nothing left of your empire to surrender." Thekver signed the documents without further protest. The aftermath of the war changed everything about how the galaxy viewed both conflict and diplomacy. The established powers, who had spent centuries believing that military might was measured in the size of fleets and the number of weapons, suddenly realized they had been thinking about warfare in completely the wrong way. Colonel Rick Barnes, now serving as the human liaison to the Galactic Council's military committee, found himself in the unusual position of explaining modern warfare to beings who still thought in terms of honorable combat between opposing forces. "The thing you have to understand," Barnes told a room full of alien military leaders, is that we don't fight wars to prove who's braver or stronger. We fight wars to win them as quickly and efficiently as possible. Everything else is just posturing. The questions came fast and furious. How had the humans coordinated such complex operations without centralized command? How had they known exactly which targets to hit for maximum effect? How had they managed to defeat a numerically superior force so completely? Barnes answered each question with the patience of someone who had been teaching military strategy for most of his career. It's not magic, he explained. It's just a different way of thinking about the problem. Instead of trying to destroy the enemy's military, we destroyed their ability to use their military effectively. The establishment of the human diplomatic corps marked the beginning of what historians would later call the American century of galactic politics. Unlike previous dominant species, humans didn't seek to rule the galaxy directly. Instead, they positioned themselves as guarantors of peace and stability, backing up their diplomacy with the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, now serving as the first human ambassador to the Galactic Council, delivered her inaugural address to a chamber that was very different from the one Captain Morrison had first addressed just months earlier. The representatives who had once seemed so confident in their established order now listened with the respectful attention usually reserved for natural disasters. We didn't come here to conquer anyone or build an empire, Rodriguez said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. We came here to make friends, do business, and explore the universe. But if you threaten our friends, disrupt our business, or get in the way of our exploration, you're going to find out why we spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of warfare. The speech was met with thunderous applause from the smaller species who had lived in fear of their more powerful neighbors for centuries. For the first time in galactic history, there was a power that protected the weak not for profit or territory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The changes were immediate and dramatic. Trade disputes that had dragged on for decades were suddenly resolved in days. Territorial conflicts that had seemed impossible to solve were settled through simple, direct negotiations. The complex web of alliances and counter-alliances that had kept the galaxy in a state of perpetual tension began to unravel as species realized they no longer needed to choose sides in ancient conflicts. Captain Morrison, now promoted to admiral, and serving as the commander of the Soul Defense Force, reflected on humanity's rapid rise to galactic prominence during what would be his final log entry from the USS Liberty. We arrived late to the party, he said, speaking to the ship's computer as he had done countless times before, brought our own weapons, and nobody invited us. But sometimes that's exactly what a party needs, someone willing to stand up to the bullies and make sure everyone has a good time. The transformation wasn't without its critics. Some of the established powers grumbled about the loss of their privileged positions. Others complained that the humans were too quick to resort to violence, too willing to ignore diplomatic niceties, and too unpredictable in their decision-making. But even the critics had to admit that the galaxy was more peaceful than it had been in centuries. Wars were ending, trade was flourishing, and smaller species were finally able to participate in galactic civilization without fear of being crushed by their more powerful neighbors. Chief Engineer Danny Walsh, now in charge of technology transfer programs, summed up the human impact in his typically direct style. We didn't invent faster-than-light travel, energy weapons, or artificial gravity, he said during a lecture at the Galactic Technical Institute. What we invented was the idea that technology should work for people, not the other way around. The lesson was spreading. Species that had spent centuries perfecting elegant but impractical technologies were suddenly asking themselves why they had made things so complicated. Research projects that had been stalled in committee for decades were suddenly moving forward as scientists adopted the human approach of building something, testing it, and fixing whatever broke. Commander Amy Patterson, now in charge of Galactic Communications, watched the changes with satisfaction. The thing about Americans, she told a group of communication specialists from 12 different species, is that we don't accept impossible as an answer. If something needs to be done, we figure out how to do it. If the rules don't work, we change the rules. If the system is broken, we fix it or build a new one. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the best solution to an old problem was to let someone new take a look at it. The humans had arrived late, armed and uninvited, but they had brought something the galaxy desperately needed: the willingness to change. The old order was gone, replaced by something more dynamic, more flexible, and more responsive to the needs of everyone involved. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than what had come before.